Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Neil Kline of New Richmond is a Republican candidate in the 29th Assembly District. The primary is August 11. Neil, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You know, your social media posts about your campaign, one of your main campaign issues is the economic future of rural Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. Can you, let's open with that. What are your ideas? How can rural Wisconsin be maintained and improved?
Well, again, thanks for having me here, Steve. I appreciate it. And in this campaign, we're really focusing on education, jobs, and healthcare. And in my view, those issues are kind of the trifecta. If you have people who have an education and they have a job and they can get better when they get sick, they're going to be best positioned to support themselves. And if they can support themselves, then they can support their families. And if they can support their families, then they can support their communities. And I really come at this campaign from my own personal background. I'm from Polk County, just north of the 29th district, and I'm anxious about the future of small towns and how they're going to be able to support themselves going forward. And I believe that by focusing on those three issues, we'll be able to do just that. And I think one example within education that I'm particularly passionate about is working to make sure that we're bringing high school and technical college closer together. I think that we do a really good job in this state, not only with the UW system, but also with the tech colleges system of maintaining a really robust higher education system. And if you're someone like me in high school who wanted to go to four-year college, there were a lot of opportunities for you as a student to advance that goal going through high school. I think we have to make sure that those options are there for tech college-bound students, and I think that we have to make sure that we celebrate that option for every student that's going through the same way that we would for anyone who goes to a four-year college. In many cases, those kids who go to tech college are going to be the ones who support those rural communities in the future, and we need to make sure they have those tools to do that.
Okay, thank you. But Governor Evers has warned that the pandemic may hurt the state's economy to the point where we may collect $2 billion with a B less in general fund taxes in this year. That could threaten state support for K-12, the UW, the tech colleges. So if you are an assembly member, you'd kind of have a choice to cut spending on some of those programs or to raise revenues with raise taxes or fees. Where would you be on that choice, Neil?
Well, I think it's important to note that under Republican leadership for the last number of budgets, we've been able to grow our rainy day fund to be, I think, at historic levels now. And that leaves us well positioned to try and manage what I think will be a difficult budget cycle. And there will be parts of the budget that have to take a trim. I don't think that I don't want to mislead anybody about that. I think that that's the reality. But for me, with the core issues that I'm really focused on in education and jobs and in healthcare, working to protect those investments and to protect those parts of the budget and look either for trims elsewhere or savings in education or jobs or healthcare. There's, I think, many opportunities potentially for savings that could be looked at. By working to make sure we do that, it will be a priority of mine to make sure that we're protecting those parts of the budget, because in my view, again, those issues relate to the long-term health of rural Wisconsin and rural people. And I don't think that we'd want to risk that long-term work because of a difficult budget cycle.
To protect those programs that you consider most important, then you're not interested in raising any taxes or fees?
I don't think that we're, in general, I'm opposed to working, to doing that unless there's a targeted reason why that people are able to buy into. I think right now, families across the state are, getting pretty beat up by the current economic situation. And we're not in a position to ask for people to give up more to ship it off to Madison. I don't think that that's something we can ask for, nor is it something we should begin asking for right now.
Okay. Americans know a lot more than they did 2 months ago about how some police officers treat some of those in custody. There are calls for statewide standards for how police treat those in custody being discussed. They're banning chokeholds, banning no-knock warrants. keeping a database on officers prone to violence. Do we need some statewide standard for how police treat those in custody, Neil?
Well, I would be willing to listen to folks who might feel that we do. I think it's important, though, to remember that our law enforcement professionals do important and in many cases dangerous work every day to protect us all. And so it's important, I think, that whenever we begin talking about limitations on what particular actions law enforcement is allowed or is not allowed to take, we have to make sure that they're part of that conversation and that they've got full buy-in to whatever's decided. But up here on the 29th, our local law enforcement performs professionally and correctly every day. And I think that we need to make sure we thank them for that work. And we also need to make sure that they're part of any conversation about how we move forward, particularly with communities of color, minority communities, and police.
Okay. States around Wisconsin have either legalized medical or medical and recreational marijuana. What's your position on that issue, Neil?
Well, on medical marijuana, I'm open to supporting legalization of that. I think that there are plenty of people who find themselves in difficult situations, and there are a lot of other states that we can learn from on that issue. I think for recreational marijuana, I'm also opening to talk about that, particularly in relation to your previous question on issues of criminal justice reform. It has huge impacts, not only on minority communities in this state, but on people across the state. And I think that we do need to think about that. The other issue, of course, though, is we have to make sure that, again, law enforcement is part of that conversation. Right now, we don't have quite the same testing abilities as we do, say, with alcohol, and particularly, operating a motor vehicle or showing up to work or things like that. So we have to make sure that we have proper tools and solutions in place to deal with those issues. But I'm certainly open to hearing about it and learning more about the issue and seeing where it leads us.
The state constitution says the party in power in the Capitol will draw the next congressional, Senate, and Assembly lines. Governor Evers has recommended a People's Commission that would recommend that would draft proposals and then forward them to elected officials. Who should draw the next set of district lines, Neil?
Well, I think that the system we have in place is there for a reason. I think that it functions, and I don't think that we need to punt it away from legislative or elected leaders to a group of other folks. I think keeping it in the legislature makes sense, and I think it's important to note as well that under the system in place, as it stands right now, maps would be drawn by the legislature, and then the governor will have an opportunity to weigh in on those maps. I also think that Republicans have good reason, and I think the state, not only Republicans, I think the state has good reason to be cautious when it comes to thinking about nonpartisan boards or other groups of non-elected folks who work on these issues. The John Doe investigation and other issues surrounding that have, I think, put a bad taste in my mouth about some of those things. And I think that it is hard to remove partisanship in these kinds of things. And it's best to make sure that it's conducted in public, in an accountable way. And the maps that the legislature votes on, I am ultimately accountable to the people I represent, and that accountability is a good thing to keep in this situation.
Two questions about COVID-19, because we live in historical times in terms of this pandemic. It's hit the economy and the healthcare providers the state relies on especially hard. Recessions cause less revenue for the state, but more demands on safety net programs like Medicaid. If you remember the Assembly voting on the next state budget, should hospitals get a greater priority than maybe they have in the past?
Well, to me, I think it kind of feeds back into your previous question about revenue and potential shortfalls. In my view, again, education, jobs, and healthcare are the priorities for me and priorities, I think, in this district. And so working to make sure that hospitals are able to provide care to people who come through their doors is, of course, an important part of that. And as I said earlier, I think making sure that those priorities are properly funded would certainly carry through. And in the midst of a pandemic, it makes it all the more important.
Okay. Follow-up question. Should businesses that have followed all prescribed COVID-19 health and safety practices and recommendations, whether from WEDC or from the CDC, should they be immune from frivolous lawsuits?
Well, I certainly am troubled, I think, as many people are with frivolous lawsuits. I think they make it harder to conduct business and to do any other number of things. And I don't think that they're a particularly useful or helpful thing to be dealing with. I think the challenge I have with the guidelines would be that it would be very important that the state adopt consistent standards that are not apt to change. And I think that until that's done, it would be difficult to properly protect businesses in that situation. And more to the point, I think if people are concerned about contracting the coronavirus, as I think many people are, everyone needs to take steps to make sure they are protecting themselves. And it's not in any business's interest to risk people getting sick. They want people to come through their doors. They want people to be spending their money there. And so I think for now, it would be important to make sure we have kind of some consistent guidelines in place that would be pretty firm to make sure that we would be able to do anything like that effectively. I would, of course, be willing to listen if those guidelines were to come in place.
The debate over how we pay for highways, Neil, has been raging for years. The state gas tax, 30.9 cents per gallon, has not been increased in more than 10 years. Would you support raising the gas tax to stabilize our highway funding?
Well, I've expressed this to people out on doors while I'm talking to people across the district. I believe that we need to find a sustainable solution to transportation funding. The gas tax, my car gets a lot better mileage today than it did than my previous car did. And so the gas tax as a tool for funding transportation, I think makes a lot of sense because it is in a sense, it's a user fee. And I like that kind of the disposition that tax then gives. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we're being responsible. I'm a fiscal conservative, and that means making sure that we are spending state tax dollars effectively and in a responsible way. And if our current system for funding transportation is not effective, then we need to make sure that we find a system that is. And I kind of think of it as an analogy to a house. If you are borrowing money to do an addition, that makes sense. That's okay. If you're borrowing money to fix the sink, then something's wrong. And we need to make sure that we're not borrowing money to fix the sink. And I think part and parcel of that, too, is to make sure that money that's been allocated by the legislature goes where the legislature wants it to go. I was disappointed that the governor vetoed the local road aid funding that was in the last budget. I don't think that helped. But I do think that a sustainable solution is required.
Okay, 2 questions on property taxes, which Wisconsin has some of the highest property taxes in the nation. That's why school districts, local governments are dealing with revenue caps and limits on what they can levy in property taxes. Although referendums, if passed, can exceed those limits. Mm-hmm. As a member of the Assembly, would you vote to keep property tax caps and limits in place or get rid of them?
I would vote to keep them in place, and I'd support doing that because, in my view, the current system isn't necessarily broken. I think that if local governments want to ask their residents for additional funding to do X, Y, and Z, a referendum is a perfect tool for that. I think it increases accountability. I think it makes sure that there's buy-in from your local community. If you want to do a renovation at a school, or if a local municipality wants to do X, Y, or Z, whatever it is, I think it makes sense that that option is there, and I think it increases accountability. So the line, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm not sure that it's broken to the point where we need to consider trying to change anything, and for that reason, I would vote to keep those caps in place.
Follow-up question. With local governments forced to rely on property taxes to provide 40% of their services, should we consider alternative revenue sources for local governments, perhaps broadening the sales tax, the 5% state sales tax, to now exempt products and services, or even giving local governments the ability to level half-cent local option sales tax?
Well, I'm sensitive to, I think, in my view, the question is the overall kind of effective tax rate and taxes that people are paying. So if we say, all right, well, property taxes we've capped, but we've created this new option for you, local government, to go and take advantage of, then we haven't really meaningfully controlled the overall tax burden that an individual in this state or a retiree in this state is facing. you are shifting who gets the hit and who's paying for it. But for me, that's the important question to be asking. And I think, to begin kind of taking from one hand and saying, well, we won't take from here, but we'll take from here, that doesn't really square with me. We have to be sensitive to maintain control over taxes in general. And that's kind of the way I approach that issue.
Thank you. A study found that in 2015, out-of-state contractors were awarded $72 million in contracts for public works projects begun by local governments. That $72 million doubled to $146 million in 2018. My question, should bidding standards and requirements give preferences to Wisconsin companies when local governments approve major public works projects?
I don't think that they should. I think that government, as with anyone else, if you're looking to, collect bids to do whatever it might be on your personal property, you're looking for the biggest bang for your buck. I think Wisconsin companies, it's important that we make sure Wisconsin companies are competitive. And I think in many cases they are. And if they win the bid, then they win the bid. But if they don't, then they should try and find out how to be more competitive. In this case, more competitive for taxpayers. And I think that if you get a good deal for taxpayers, then that makes sense. And that's what should be done.
Okay, two final questions, Neil. We've talked about a lot of issues. Have we not touched on any major campaign themes that are part of why you're seeking the assembly? Any other issue you want to bring up now?
I think we've covered them pretty well with education, jobs, and healthcare. I think that these are forward-looking issues that I'm really excited to talk about in the campaign, and I'm hearing that from people across the district while I'm out and about.
Then the final question, differences between you and your opponent on August 11th?
Well, I think that, there's a slate of good people who are running here in the 29th. I think that the issues that I'm focusing on really are geared towards making sure that that rural people and rural places are able to support themselves. And I think that focus, if we don't talk about those issues and we don't make sure that voters hear about those issues, I think we're missing the mark. And I really want to make sure that the next generation, that my generation and the generation after me and the generation ahead of me is able to support themselves and their families. So being that forward-looking candidate and someone who's focusing on making sure that small towns can support themselves, I'm excited about that. And I'm getting a lot of excitement about that too up here in the district.
Thank you. Neil Kline of New Richmond is a Republican candidate in the 29th Assembly District. The primary election is August 11th. Neil, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.